where warmth was a luxury and cold was a predator. Tonight, we begin not with a gunfight, not with galloping horses or a saloon brawl. Tonight, we begin with a draft of icy wind sneaking through a crooked wooden wall, with breath that rises in mist inside your own home, with a mother waking before dawn, fingers numb, hoping her children made it through the night without turning blue. This is not the Wild West of stories. This is the Wild West of winter, of frostbitten toes and frozen wells, of cracked hands that chopped wood until they bled, of quiet deaths beneath quilts too thin and walls too open. This was the frontier most feared, not because of bandits or outlaws, but because of the cold. Endless, creeping, cruel cold. And yet, against the odds, people survived. They built cabins with their bare hands, slept beside livestock, and wrapped themselves in whatever scraps they could find. They burned everything they didn't need, and some things they did, just to keep the fire alive through one more night. It was not a place for the faint-hearted, but for those who endured it. Winter was not just a season. It was a test of ingenuity, stubbornness, and quiet courage. In the chapters ahead, we will walk slowly through that world, step by frozen step. We will explore how settlers survived brutal winters in a land that did not care whether they lived or died. We will visit their cabins, peer into their hearths, and listen to the whispered tricks passed between neighbors and across generations. You won't need to shiver tonight. Your bed is warm. The walls are solid. And the worst you'll face is the soft sound of my voice as I take you back to a time when warmth was not expected, but earned. Let's begin this slow journey into survival, not through valor or violence, but through quiet, stubborn warmth. Close your eyes. Let the cold world fade into view. And sleep well, knowing that you're about to learn how people endured a cold that could kill, with nothing more than wood, wool, and will. A land not made for winter. The American West was not built for winter. Not the kind of winter that seeped into bone and soul. Not the kind that howled across open plains with no mercy, that buried your home in snow by morning and froze your water by noon. Yet that was the reality waiting for thousands of settlers who crossed into the frontier chasing dreams. Dreams of land, of freedom, of something more than the crowded streets and factories they'd left behind. No one told them the wind here could peel the flesh from your cheeks, that it would push through the smallest cracks in your cabin, chilling you even beneath your quilts. That in the high country, the snow didn't fall. It conquered. The first mistake, underestimating the West. The West, in the popular mind of the 1800s, was fertile, rich, full of promise. Men carried pamphlets promising mild climates, fertile soil, and open land as far as the eye could see. But those pamphlets did not mention the mountains. They didn't mention the high desert plains. They didn't mention that in places like Wyoming, Montana, Colorado, and the Dakota Territories, winter lasted not 3 months, but 6, sometimes longer. And so, people came with spring in their hearts. They arrived in wagons, tired but hopeful. They staked out land and dug shallow wells. They built log homes that barely held together, not knowing that the real test of their strength would come not from wild animals or hostile strangers, but from cold, from snow, from silence. The cold arrived slowly, then all at once. It didn't happen overnight. The first chill crept in gently, a breeze across your neck while you worked the fields, a crust of frost on the bucket left outside. Then the mornings began to bite. The earth stiffened underfoot. The chickens hesitated to leave their coop. The sun rose later, and when it did, it brought little warmth. By late October, everything changed. The first real snow came in silence, a slow, gentle fall that dusted the plains like powdered sugar. But it didn't melt. The next day, it returned, heavier. The wind came with it. By the third storm, the roads disappeared. So did the paths. The world turned white. And still, the cold kept coming. The terrain turned hostile. In spring, the land was vast and beautiful. By December, it was dangerous. The trees groaned under snow. The hills became traps for wagon wheels and cattle. Lakes froze over, deceptively thin at first, then like iron. Travel was nearly impossible. Horses couldn't pull sleds through deep snowdrifts without collapsing. Roads became rumors. And for those who settled far from towns, there was only one option. Stay inside. Endure. Hope that what they had would last. A house that couldn't keep out the cold. The typical frontier cabin was not designed for comfort. It was built from felled logs, sealed with mud or clay, if the builder had time and help. Many were built hastily before the first frost, with gaps in the walls and no insulation. Glass windows were a luxury. Most homes had only oiled paper stretched over frames. The roof might be thatch or crude shingles. It leaked. And beneath the home, only earth. No foundation. Just dirt, hardening as the temperature dropped. Inside, every breath was visible. Children slept in full clothes, sometimes in hats. Quilts were piled high. The stove, when lit, warmed only the center of the room. The corners stayed cold. Sometimes, frost formed on the inside of the walls. Isolation sets in. As winter settled, the isolation deepened. Neighbors were miles away. Visiting them meant strapping on snowshoes and hoping the weather held. Few dared it. The family became the entire world. And for many, especially women, it became a lonely world. While men chopped wood or ventured to check traps, women stayed home. They sewed. They cooked from dwindling stores. They held children close when the winds wailed outside. There were no newspapers, no letters, no church, no visitors. Only the sound of snow falling onto the roof, the creak of timber settling, the occasional cough, always feared in winter. Nightfall was the enemy. Night came early. The sun disappeared behind gray clouds by late afternoon. The world darkened quickly, and with darkness came danger. Not of wolves or bears, though those too, but of the cold growing sharper. Fires needed tending constantly. Let the fire die, and you might not wake up. One parent always rose before dawn to restart the stove, sometimes using the last of the dry kindling. Matches were counted. Coal was guarded like gold. Sometimes the fire was kept alive with dried animal dung or stripped bark, whatever would catch. Children were wrapped in everything the home had. 2 or 3 shared a bed, their toes touching, stealing heat from each other. Those who didn't prepare. Some didn't survive their first winter. They hadn't stored enough food. They hadn't cut enough wood. Their cabins were too far from help. They froze, or starved, or both. Settlers were buried in shallow graves, or not at all, when the ground grew too hard to dig. In some cases, neighbors found cabins abandoned in spring, doors swinging open, a single quilt-covered form beneath a collapsed roof, a forgotten name, a forgotten dream. And so, the next settlers learned. Prepare better, build thicker, stay closer to water. Always have more firewood than you think you need. Always. The beginning of respect. By the end of the first winter, those who survived knew something deeper than hardship. They knew respect. Respect for the land, for the weather, for the silence. They no longer cursed the wind. They listened to it. They measured snowfall not in inches, but in effort, how long it would take to shovel, to melt, to endure. And when the first crocus bloomed through the crust of snow in April, or sometimes May, it wasn't just a flower. It was victory. A land not made for winter, but endured anyway. The West was not meant for comfort. But that didn't stop people from calling it home. They bent its harshness into routine. They shaped their days around the fire, their meals around what could be stored, their nights around the rhythm of chopping wood and keeping watch. They didn't just survive the brutal cold. They grew strong in it, quietly, slowly, in frost and firelight. And so, winter by winter, the frontier was settled, not by the strongest, but by the most enduring. The ones who stayed. The ones who waited out the wind. The ones who refused to let the cold have the last word. Building a shelter that could survive a storm. No one built their first cabin expecting to freeze in it. The idea was simple. Find land. Chop trees. Stack logs. Roof it. Shelter secured. But winter had other plans. The frontier didn't offer mercy. It offered wind. It offered snow so heavy it cracked beams. It offered nights where your breath froze on your pillow. And it demanded that your shelter do more than stand. It had to protect. This is the story of how early settlers learned, slowly and painfully, to build homes that didn't just exist, but endured. A cabin in a hurry. Most settlers didn't arrive in summer. They arrived in spring, or worse, fall, with just weeks before the frost. They brought little. A saw, a hatchet, maybe a borrowed horse. And they built as quickly as possible. Felled trees became walls. Clay or mud was shoved between logs as chinking. The roof, whatever they could manage. Wooden shingles if they had the time, straw or bark if they didn't. The floor was dirt. The windows were holes. They were not homes. They were barriers between the body and the wind. And even then, the wind usually won. The first snowfall teaches fast. The first snowfall wasn't beautiful. It was terrifying. The roof sagged. The gaps in the wall whistled with icy wind. Inside, the fire sputtered and shadows danced on bare wood. Snow piled against the door. Cold slipped in through every crack. Children shivered even under quilts. Water froze in the bucket beside the bed. And still, the walls stood. It wasn't comfort. It was containment. Outside was death. Inside was survival. Barely. Improvisation by desperation. By the second winter, settlers were wiser. They stuffed moss between logs, hammered mud into every seam, hung thick quilts on the walls to block the draft. Newspapers, if they had them, were glued to inner beams, not for reading, but for warmth. Some dug small entryways into the ground, a sort of crude mudroom, to trap cold air before it reached the main door. Others built bunk beds not out of convenience, but for heat, warm air rises, and the upper bed stayed less cold. The ceilings were lowered. The doors were made smaller. Heat, like food, had to be preserved. Windows without glass. Glass was a luxury most couldn't afford, and so they improvised. Greased paper was stretched over frames, letting in light but blocking wind. Animal skins were tacked over open holes, pulled back only during daylight hours. Some used horn or mica, sliced thin and translucent. Rare. Fragile. But most lived in gloom. Light meant cold. Open meant danger. And so homes were dark. Quiet. Still. The hearth. Center of survival. At the heart of every shelter was a stove. Cast iron, squat, and hungry. It burned endlessly. Logs fed into its mouth day and night, like an offering to some small, smoky god. Without it, there was no life. The stove did more than heat. It cooked. It dried wet boots. It thawed stiff fingers. It boiled the water that might otherwise freeze. And yet, its reach was limited. The floor near it stayed warm. But the corners of the room, ice crept in. Settlers learned to sleep with their heads near the stove and their feet wrapped in furs. Sometimes, bricks were heated inside it, then carried to bed, tucked beside frozen toes. Every surface had a job. Nothing in the cabin was decorative. Ropes hung from the ceiling, not for style, but to dry clothes and herbs. Hooks were nailed into every beam to hold lanterns, tools, or meat. The table doubled as a chopping surface. The stools could be firewood in an emergency. Even the walls were functional. Furs were nailed in thick patches for insulation. Shelves held the year's dried beans and last summer's preserves. Sometimes there was barely room to walk. But everything had purpose. Efficiency was the only luxury they could afford. The door that would not open. In deep winter, the door disappeared. Snow piled high against it, sometimes to the roof. The family inside had to dig out each morning, not for freedom, but for air. A small shovel was kept near the stove, warmed and ready. Some settlers began building their doors to open inward, not out. Others carved narrow tunnels leading out the side of their cabin, escape routes, in case the snow became too much. One morning, a man awoke and found light only through the chimney. Every wall, every exit, was sealed by snow. He waited 2 days before tunneling out with a frying pan. The sound of a settling roof. The roof groaned in the night. Snow pressed down like a silent giant. If the cabin was built well, the weight held. If it wasn't, the logs split. Beams gave way. Sometimes, families awoke to the stars above them and the snow falling in. To prevent this, settlers used steep angles. Let the snow fall off before it crushed you. They braced ceilings with extra beams. They swept snow from the roof after each storm, risking frostbite to save the home. Because one bad storm could mean starting over. If they lived through it. Inside wasn't always safe. Even indoors, danger lived. Smoke from the stove filled the room if the pipe clogged. Wet boots froze solid, cracked, and became useless. Ice crept in through walls. Once, a girl found her braid frozen to the wall as she slept. The cold had kissed her hair and clung to it. Sometimes, mice came looking for warmth. So did wolves. A man once awoke to find a gray snout pressed against the window hole, sniffing at the firelight. Shelter did not mean safety. It meant margin. A thin layer between life and death. Not just a cabin, a fortress of will. Over time, these shelters became more than homes. They became testaments. Every plank, every stone, every stitched quilt spoke of endurance. Of refusal, of defiance, against wind, against hunger, against despair. The walls held stories, of quiet nights, of bitter arguments, of newborn cries and final breaths. And in spring, when the snow melted and the door opened again, those inside stepped out, not as survivors, but as residents of a land that hadn't wanted them, but had failed to drive them away. The fire that had to stay lit. In the Wild West, the fire was more than warmth. It was survival. Without it, food did not cook. Water did not melt. Fingers stiffened and cracked. Toes went blue. But perhaps most terrifying of all, without the fire, the cabin turned silent. Not peaceful silent. Dead silent. In a land where temperatures dropped below zero for weeks, a simple flame was the line between breath and stillness. And so, they fed it. Through the night. Through snow. Through fear. Through exhaustion. They fed it like it was alive. Because it was. The heart of the cabin. Every cabin had a heart, and that heart was cast iron. Stout, black, and loud with creaks and clicks, the stove took up precious space. But it gave everything in return. A few glowing logs could radiate life, could dry soaked mittens, could chase frost from a baby's breath. But only just. Step 3 feet away, and the cold returned. It pressed in through the walls, settled into the corners like waiting ghosts. The fire was the eye of a tiny storm of heat in a house drowning in snow. And it could not be allowed to die. Not even for a moment. The keeper of the flame. There was always one. A person in every household who rose before dawn, or never slept, or woke again and again. The firekeeper. Sometimes the father. Often the mother. Always someone weary. They watched the coals. They stirred ash. They added splinters, bark, dried dung, whatever burned. They kept the belly of the stove full, even if their own bellies were not. Matches were rationed. Flint grew dull. Starting a fire from scratch was not a risk worth taking. It was easier to stay awake, to guard the glow. The ritual of night. Evening brought a quiet routine. The fire was stacked high, not for warmth then, but for endurance. Thicker logs. Dry bark. Kindling hidden deep to catch sparks as others slept. Sometimes a brick was heated in the fire, then wrapped in cloth and placed beneath the bed covers. Babies were swaddled and laid beside the stove on straw mats, and the firekeeper curled close to it, never too far, never relaxed. They dozed, but always with one ear open for the crackle's change. A dying fire didn't scream. It whispered, and that whisper could be fatal. What burned when wood ran out? Firewood wasn't infinite. Many settlers ran out before spring arrived, and when they did, they burned anything they could. Old stools, floorboards, roof beams, broken handles. A child once wept as her mother fed their only wooden doll into the fire. Nothing sentimental survived long. In some cabins, entire interior walls were stripped by February. Doors were burned and replaced with quilts. Furniture vanished piece by piece. There was no shame in it. The cabin could be rebuilt. The people could not. The smell of smoke, always. The cabin always smelled of smoke. It clung to clothes, to quilts, to skin. It burned eyes and choked infants. Some days the smoke hung thick under the ceiling like low clouds. Chimneys clogged with snow or soot. Some settlers had no chimneys, just holes cut through the logs. The wind sometimes blew smoke back inside, and yet no one complained. Smoke meant warmth. Smoke meant the fire still lived. Smoke meant no one had died that night, so they lived with it. Eyes red, lungs raw, hearts grateful. Fire was food. Boiling water. Steaming beans. Melting snow for tea. All of it needed flame. No fire meant no food. No warmth meant dry grains stayed hard. No meat could thaw. No kettle would whistle. Mothers leaned over the stove, ladling thin broth while their fingers froze. Fathers waited for the pot to bubble before pouring tiny mugs. Even a hot potato was a miracle. A moment of heat, held in both hands. A bite that steamed in your mouth. Proof that the fire had done its job. Choking cold. When the fire died, everything changed. The silence turned cruel. The cold climbed in. Water pails froze solid. Blankets stiffened. Breath turned into frost that settled on walls. To relight a fire meant more than finding wood. It meant survival. But striking flint with shaking hands is no easy task. Fingers lost feeling. Noses bled. Some never managed. They were found in spring, curled beside blackened stoves. Frozen kettles beside them. Blankets drawn up to the chin, as if that final gesture might stop what was coming. Fire as faith. And so they prayed to it. Not as pagans. Not as fools. But as people who knew the only God that answered in winter was flame. They fed it offerings, their time, their tools, their sleep. They blessed its heat. They sang beside it. They taught their children how to watch it, how to see the signs of dying embers. They trusted it, and they feared it, because a single gust of wind, a single mistake, could end it all. The last log of winter. By March, the last log was sacred. It was touched reverently, watched carefully. They saved it for when the sky turned black and snow began to fall again, because it always did. And when that last log was fed into the fire, and it cracked and hissed and flared, the family watched it together. Not in sadness, not in celebration, but in silent understanding. That winter was nearly over, that the fire had stayed lit, that they had, for one more year, survived. What they ate when there was nothing left. They never planned to starve. No one stepped into the frontier thinking they would one day eat bark, or boil leather, or chew on bones that had already been chewed once before. But winter didn't care what people planned. Winter took what it wanted. And when the snow came early, and the root cellar froze, and the game disappeared, and the wind made hunting impossible, when all that happened, the food ran out. And when the food ran out, the people changed. At first, there was denial. They counted cans. They rearranged sacks. They made the beans stretch further than ever before. Water was added to every stew until it barely tasted like anything at all. Bread was made from cracked corn or old flour, dense, bitter, hard as stone. But it filled the belly, at least for a while. And then came the rationing. The mother cut portions smaller each day, careful not to let her children notice. The father pretended he wasn't hungry, giving his slice of jerky to the youngest without a word. Meals became whispers, apologies, prayers. The food didn't run out all at once. It faded. It vanished so gradually that by the time the final potato was sliced and boiled and shared, no one cried. They simply stared at the empty shelf and said nothing. Next came the traps. Outside, the snow lay thick and cruel, but the father still went out. He checked snares for rabbits, steel jaws hidden beneath the drifts. Most came up empty. A few held frozen twigs, snapped under the weight of hope. Once he found a squirrel, stiff, thin, barely meat at all. Still they ate it, roasted over the stove until the bones cracked. The children smiled for the first time in days. But squirrels were rare, and the forest was silent. The animals had gone underground or died. So the family turned to what was left. They boiled the bones from earlier meals, again and again, coaxing the last trace of fat into thin broth. They scraped the soot from the stove's inner walls and wondered aloud if it was still food. A leather belt was soaked in hot water for hours, cut into strips, chewed slowly like jerky. It tasted of smoke and misery. The children grew quiet. The mother fainted one morning as she stirred an empty pot. The father began sleeping longer each day. Then came the bark. Stripped from aspen trees, scraped, boiled. The inner layer, pale and bitter, was supposed to be edible. Supposed to keep you going. It did, barely. It filled the stomach just long enough to keep the body from collapsing. Their mouths blistered. Their stomachs cramped. Still they chewed. And when even bark became hard to find, when the nearby trees had been stripped and snow fell deeper than the windowsill, they turned to the cellar. Not for food. For rats. The father set new traps. Metal, quiet, brutal. He didn't tell the children what he caught. He cleaned the meat alone, cooked it dark and fast, flavored it with salt from the bottom of an old barrel. They called it stew. They did not ask questions. The mother looked away when she fed her baby. They had passed the line of hunger into desperation. The kind of desperation that whispers things in the dark. That makes you stare at your neighbor's livestock with envy. That makes your fingers shake when you hold a knife, not from cold, but from thoughts you don't want to have. But still they endured. And then one day, the father did not come back from the traps. The mother found him in the snow, curled like a child, eyes open, hands frozen around a single rabbit. She carried him back. She wrapped him. She told the children he was just resting. That night, they cooked the rabbit, and no one spoke his name. They stayed silent through the long storm that followed. And when the wind died down and the sky cleared, and the snow began to melt at last, they found a tin behind the stove. One the father must have hidden long ago. Inside, dried beans, a single onion, a paper twist of salt. The mother wept, and they ate, in silence, each bite a funeral and a salvation. Spring came 3 days later. The snow turned to mud. The creek ran again. The trees, stripped and scarred, began to bud. The youngest child saw a bird for the first time in weeks and asked, "Is it food?" The mother smiled. Weakly, sadly. "No," she said, "not yet." How illness came with the cold. It didn't begin with coughing. It began with stillness. The kind of stillness that felt too heavy, too long. The kind that settled over the supper table like ash. No questions, no laughter, just the slow drag of a spoon across a wooden bowl and the quiet sound of breathing that didn't sound quite right. It began with the boy. He was always the smallest, always the first to feel things before anyone else, cold in his fingers, hunger in his belly, fear in his bones. At first it was just fatigue. He leaned against the cabin wall longer than usual. He stopped reaching for seconds. He didn't ask to go outside. His cheeks, once flushed from firelight and snow, had turned pale and waxy. The family noticed. But noticing didn't change anything. There was no doctor. Not within walking distance. Not within snow-covered miles of dense forest and forgotten roads. The snow had sealed them in. The path to town was gone, erased beneath wind and drift and silence. So they waited. The mother watched him through narrowed eyes. She placed her hand on his forehead and said nothing. The girl, the boy's sister, held his hand beneath the quilts and whispered stories from memory. The father added more logs to the fire and told them it was nothing. Just tiredness. Just winter settling into their bones like it always did. But it wasn't. The boy stopped speaking. He lay curled beneath furs and blankets, a hollow little bundle of heat that never seemed to grow. His breath came shallow, then deeper, then shallow again. His lips were dry. His eyes fluttered but didn't open. The mother boiled herbs. Not real medicine, there was none, but warm water infused with dried plants hung over the hearth from summer. Thyme. Onion peel. A pinch of salt saved from the last trade. She whispered while she stirred. Not words of healing, but words of begging. Outside, the wind scratched the cabin like claws on old wood. The snow built higher against the walls. A storm was rising again, the third that week. The fire hissed from melting ice dripping through cracks in the roof. The cabin, once a place of laughter and rhythm and family, had become a sickroom. A shelter from life, but not from death. The cough started on the 4th day. It was dry at first, gentle, almost a sigh. The boy would shudder, as if surprised by it. Then it worsened, wet, deeper. His whole chest shook with each spasm. The blankets lifted with each violent breath. The mother held him upright while he coughed into rags she had once sewn for washing, now dark with blood. They stopped eating together. They stopped sleeping. The girl began to cough too. Hers was different, high, painful, echoing off the log walls like a warning. The mother pressed her own lips shut, not because she didn't want to speak, but because she had started coughing too, and didn't want anyone to hear. The father worked in silence. He kept the fire going. He broke apart the last of the kindling. He cut strips from the chairs. He boiled snow for water. He dragged in logs soaked through from the storm and dried them in a ring around the stove. The house smelled of damp ash and stale breath. He didn't say anything, because what could he say? There was no medicine. There was no one to call. And then he heard it, the sound that didn't belong. Silence again. Not the stillness from earlier, but the kind that follows a final breath. He rushed to the boy's side. His chest had stopped rising. The quilt didn't move. The air was still. And the father knelt there for hours. The mother said nothing. She had no voice left. She only wiped her son's forehead one last time and wrapped him tighter in the blanket he had been born in, the one she had sewn by hand when they first arrived on this land. She did not cry. Her tears had frozen somewhere between fever and grief. They placed his small body in the cellar. They could not bury him. The ground was stone, impenetrable, frozen to the depth of a man's height and harder than iron. They dug anyway, until the father's hands bled, until the spade snapped. Then they stopped. He lay beneath the floor, beside the root jars and salt sacks that were now mostly empty. The fire burned lower that night. The father watched it like a man watches a dying animal, hoping it would fight, fearing it would fail. He coughed. Once, twice, then turned away. The girl's fever spiked. She thrashed in her sleep, spoke in words that made no sense, cried out for names they didn't recognize. She kicked away the blankets, then clung to them again. The mother pressed cold rags to her head, then warm ones, then wrapped her in all the clothes they had left. The mother's own cough grew worse. She slept sitting up now, because lying down made it worse. Her breath rasped in her chest like paper tearing. Her eyes were rimmed with red. Her lips cracked open in the corners. The father held both her hands in his. He did not speak. They had said all that could be said. He moved through the days like a ghost. He boiled broth that wasn't broth, just water, salt, and steam. He crushed herbs with his knife handle. He sang to his daughter in a hoarse whisper. And when he coughed again, this time there was blood. But he said nothing, because they were still breathing. And if they were still breathing, then he would keep working. The wind howled louder. Another night came. He burned the last of the bedding that wasn't on the beds. He burned the cradle. He burned the legs of the table. The room shrank with every sacrifice. The girl was still feverish, but something in her changed. She stopped muttering. Her breath grew steadier. Her skin cooled. She stopped sweating. She did not wake, but she no longer twisted in pain. The mother felt it first. A shift. A hope so fragile she didn't dare speak it. The father stoked the fire with what was left, a Bible page, a bit of chair leg, the broken-handled spoon. The girl opened her eyes. She did not speak, but she saw them. She reached out, and they wept. For the first time in days, they wept. Because she had come back. Because she had not gone where the boy had gone. Because they were not lost. Not yet. Spring had not arrived. But they had survived the worst of it. And somewhere beneath the snow, the earth was still there, waiting. What the cold took from their minds. The cold didn't just take fingers. It didn't just take toes. It took thoughts. It stole reason, peeled memory from the inside, and rewrote it with snow. It didn't announce itself loudly, not like the coughing or the hunger. No, the cold came for the mind gently, like a fog rolling across a frozen field. You didn't notice when it arrived, but you noticed when it stayed. At first, there were pauses. Long ones. Too long. A spoon held in midair while the eyes unfocused. A name forgotten at the end of a sentence. A coat placed in the fire instead of firewood. The family told themselves it was just fatigue. After all, they hadn't truly rested in weeks. The boy was gone. The girl had nearly followed him. The fire barely lived. The nights were longer than anything they'd ever known. So yes, they were tired. That's what they told themselves. But deep down, something quieter was unfolding. Something deeper than exhaustion. The father stopped praying aloud. The mother stared into her tea for hours. The girl, recovered physically but pale and withdrawn, took to drawing the same shape on the wall every morning. A circle, then another around it, and another still, until the entire wall was covered in dark soot rings. No one stopped her. It was the only thing that gave her any sense of pattern. The days became harder to tell apart. Snow still fell outside, but even that began to lose its meaning. A white world was all they'd known for so long that they no longer noticed it was white. It was simply everything. The mother once boiled water and forgot to pour it. It sat in the kettle until it turned to ice again. When she tried to lift it, the bottom cracked and split from the cold. The girl laughed. A strange, broken sound. And for a moment, her mother laughed too. But then neither could explain why. One morning, the father woke to find his wife standing over the stove with a piece of wood in her hand. She was carving it, slowly, methodically, into the shape of a doll. Not because she missed toys, but because she believed it was a person. "This is Ruth," she said, not looking up. "Who?" he asked. "Our neighbor. From Illinois." They had never lived in Illinois. He took the wood gently from her hands, set it on the shelf. She let him. Later that day, he found her whispering to it. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat by the stove, watching the door, as if something might come through. But nothing ever did. The danger wasn't outside anymore. It had moved in. The girl began muttering in her sleep. Sometimes in full sentences. Sometimes in languages she'd never spoken before. She once sat up in the middle of the night and said, "The well's dry." "There is no well," her father whispered. There was. He didn't answer, because maybe there had been. The human mind is not built for isolation. Not like this. Not in this kind of cold. In cities, winter is something that happens outside. In towns, it's managed with firewood and neighbors and occasional visits to church. But in the Wild West, in a cabin tucked so deep into the woods that even the wind forgets its name, winter doesn't happen around you. It happens inside you. It changes the shape of your thoughts. It erodes your sense of time. It makes you forget what the world ever felt like when it was green. The girl stopped drawing circles. She began counting instead. Out loud. Every morning. 7, 12, 19, 31. She would say a number, then walk to a wall, touch it, then start again. Sometimes she forgot she'd already done it, and started again. The father tried to distract her with chores. He gave her tasks: gather bark, sweep the ash, grind the last bit of grain into flour. But the tasks never stayed in her hands. Her eyes wandered. Her fingers twitched. She'd return hours later, holding nothing, her boots soaked through. The mother spoke less and less. She began wearing a scarf around her head inside the house. Not for warmth, but to block the whispers, she claimed. "What whispers?" the father asked. "The ones in the floorboards," she said. "They talk about the cellar. They want us down there." He didn't laugh. He didn't dismiss her. Because, truthfully, he'd heard it too. At night, when everyone was asleep, he sometimes swore he heard footsteps below. Not rats. Not wood creaking. But bare feet. Slow. Heavy. He would light the lamp and go down. Of course, the cellar was empty. Only root sacks, cracked jars, and the quilts that had once held his son. But each time, he came back feeling colder. Not in skin, but in soul. He stopped going down. The girl once wandered out into the storm again. This time, no scream. No door left open. He simply woke up and she was gone. He followed her tracks, like before. But they didn't go far. He found her kneeling by the creek, whispering to the ice. "There's a face in it," she said. He looked. There wasn't. But she swore it smiled at her. He didn't argue. He carried her back. The next morning, she didn't speak at all. That was how the winter began to win. Not through death, but through silence. Through the slow erosion of the parts that made them human. Language, memory, affection, routine. The mother stopped wearing her boots. Claimed they belonged to someone else. When her husband insisted, she threw them into the fire. He didn't retrieve them. The girl sat in the corner and stroked the air. The father whispered stories to himself. Tales from books he'd once read as a child. He got them wrong. Repeated chapters. Forgot endings. Made up new ones. One day he caught himself trying to climb out the window instead of opening the door. He stopped. Sat down. Didn't move for hours. They were all unraveling. But slowly. So slowly they barely noticed it. Until one morning, the girl looked at him and said, "What's your name again?" He opened his mouth. And couldn't remember. That night, he wrote it on the cabin wall with charcoal. Just in case. The mother burned a towel, believing it was a letter from her sister. The girl built a pile of wood in the middle of the room and called it a second fire. The father stood outside, shirtless, until his skin turned blue. And then, all at once, the snow stopped falling. It didn't melt yet, but it paused. The sky lightened. The air smelled different. Birds didn't return, but the wind shifted. The girl slept through the night without whispering. The mother hummed, once, while heating water. The father stood up, shaved his face for the first time in weeks, and didn't cut himself. It was not spring, but it was something close. And the cold, though still there, had retreated just a step. But the damage it had done, that would linger. Because the cold doesn't just steal heat. It steals names. It steals stories. It steals whatever it can't freeze. And leaves behind the rest. When neighbors finally came, they hadn't expected anyone. Not after all that time. Not after the silence. Not after the snow had made the world feel like a sealed tomb buried in ice. But one morning, as the last frost clung to the edge of the window, as the fire burned low and the mother boiled weak tea with trembling hands, the girl stood near the door and tilted her head. Then she whispered something her father could not quite hear. He turned, and then he heard it too. Hoofbeats. Distant. Soft. Uneven. At first, he thought it was the wind again, playing tricks. The mind heard things in winter. After weeks of quiet, even a breath could sound like thunder. But this was real. Someone was approaching. He stood and opened the cabin door for the first time in days. A figure emerged between the thinning trees. On horseback. Slow. Wrapped in heavy furs. The horse looked tired. The rider looked even more so. The father didn't speak. He simply stepped outside, boots crunching the brittle crust of snow. His breath fogged in the air. The world was still silent, but not dead anymore. The man on the horse raised one hand in greeting. "Been trying to reach you since the thaw," he said. His voice was hoarse. His face was wind-burned. A scarf covered most of his mouth, but the eyes were familiar. It was the neighbor from over the ridge, Tom Viry. A man who'd helped build the fence 2 summers ago. A man they had not seen since autumn. Behind him came another. Then a third. They were on foot, carrying bundles. They stopped a few yards away, uncertain. The father didn't move. The girl appeared in the doorway behind him, her hair tangled, her eyes hollow. She did not speak. The mother remained seated, unaware or unwilling to react. And for a moment, both groups just stood, watching each other like strangers on foreign land. Then the father said, "You came." It was not a question. It was not gratitude. Just a statement. The neighbor nodded. Snow cut the pass. "We tried before." The father nodded slowly, then looked down at his hands. He hadn't noticed until that moment how dark they were, how much dirt had built into the cracks, how his nails had yellowed, how his sleeves were more patch than cloth. He stepped aside. "Come in." They did, cautiously, one at a time. The door shut behind them, and the cabin became smaller than ever before. They sat at the edge of the room. The guests, the intruders, the outside world, now pressed tightly into four log walls. And still no one said much. The girl sat in her corner, drawing her soot circles again, as if the visitors weren't even real. The mother looked up once, her eyes cloudy. Then she whispered, "Did they bring salt?" It was the first thing she'd said in 2 days. Tom Viry reached into his coat and produced a small leather pouch. He handed it to her. She took it slowly, then smiled, barely, and said nothing more. They brought more than salt. There was flour, dry beans, lard wrapped in wax paper, a bit of sugar in a cloth sack, matches, soap, dried apples, even coffee. The father stared at the coffee longer than anything else. He didn't drink it. He didn't speak. Just stared. One of the younger men, Viry's cousin, maybe, touched the pot by the fire and asked if he could make something. The father nodded. And that was how the cabin came back to life. Not with music, not with joy, but with steam. Hot food. Real scent. For the first time in weeks, something new filled the air. The smell of beans boiling with onion. The hiss of oil on cast iron. The sound of conversation. Not loud, not happy, but conversation nonetheless. The guests asked nothing of the family. They didn't question the daughter's silence, or the mother's fixed gaze, or the black soot circles covering the walls like some forgotten script. They saw, and they chose not to ask. Because out here, in these parts, in these winters, questions were sometimes worse than silence. That night, the neighbors stayed. They unrolled wool blankets near the fire. One kept watch outside, near the horses. The girl whispered to the fire in a language no one understood. In the morning, she was gone. They found her kneeling behind the cabin, her hands pressed into the half-thawed ground. "What are you doing?" Viry asked gently. She looked up. Her voice came like a thread. "It's soft again." He didn't press. He simply nodded, and left her there, in silence. Later that day, they dug a grave. It was slow work. The earth resisted them at first, but not like before. The frost had finally started to break. The girl stood nearby, holding a small bundle of cloth. Her brother, wrapped months ago, unspoken since. They buried him beneath a sapling. The ground took him quietly. No prayers, no words, only breath, only wind. When they returned inside, the cabin felt different. Larger, not because it had grown, but because the dead no longer occupied it. Only the living remained, if they could still be called that. The neighbors didn't stay long after that. Just 2 more nights. They patched a hole in the roof, rehung the cabin door, chopped wood for a week's fire, left supplies. Then they went. Before they left, Tom Viry shook the father's hand. It was a hard grip, rough, real. "You'll be all right," he said. The father nodded, but he didn't agree, because he wasn't sure. After they were gone, the family didn't speak much. They ate more, slept longer. The mother began brushing her hair again. The girl stared less often into corners. The father swept the floor without being asked. But things were different now. The world had re-entered their lives, and it didn't fit the same way. The soot circles were still on the wall. The cellar was still silent. But outside, Birds returned. The sky turned blue again. Grass poked through ice. And somewhere, in the distance, more neighbors might be preparing to visit. The girl stopped whispering to the fire. She began humming again. The tune had no name. It didn't need one, because it belonged to survivors, and no one else. When the earth turned back to life, it didn't happen all at once. Spring never does. It wasn't a trumpet of green or a burst of birdsong. It was quieter than that. Slower, almost reluctant. It began with the smell. A faint one, damp, rich, the scent of earth remembering what it used to be. The snow was still on the ground, but it had softened. Its edges were giving up. It no longer crunched underfoot, it sighed. The girl noticed it first. She stepped outside one morning, barefoot despite her father's protests, and sank half an inch into the thawing slush. Instead of pulling back, she stood still and closed her eyes. She whispered a single word. Alive. No one answered her. They were still afraid to speak too soon. The fire still burned in the cabin. The cellar was still half empty. The mother's cough had returned that week, soft but persistent. The father still woke in the middle of the night, reaching for a boy who wasn't there. But outside, the world had begun its slow undoing. The creek, once locked in silence, murmured now, tentative. Its voice weak, like someone recovering from a long illness. Water trickled beneath the ice, found old paths, carved new ones. Birds returned without warning. One morning there were none, and by noon 3 of them fluttered above the ridge, chattering as if nothing had ever happened. The girl smiled, but only briefly, because joy, like spring, was still too fragile to carry. The earth emerged in patches, dark, soggy, and trembling. Grass did not grow yet. Flowers dared not bloom. But mud returned, and mud was honest. You couldn't lie in the mud. You couldn't pretend in it. You could only kneel and sink and remember. The family began moving more. They no longer slept through midday. The father chopped wood again, not out of desperation, but preparation. The girl helped him gather bark. She didn't hum, but she didn't whisper either. The mother swept the floor, even though no one had tracked snow in for days. The soot circles faded, not because they were scrubbed away, but because the fire's smoke no longer clung to the walls the same way. The cabin breathed differently. One afternoon, the father opened both shutters at once. Light poured in. Not the gray wash of winter sun, but something golden, thick, and strange. They blinked into it like moles emerging from a long tunnel. Their skin, pale and paper-thin, drank it in greedily. But still, they didn't speak of spring. Not yet, because winter had left something behind. Something deeper than snow. The girl began writing again. Not words, just marks. Lines in the dirt. Stones arranged in spirals. Threads hung from the rafters, tied in small knots. The mother didn't stop her. The father watched in silence. They understood she wasn't broken. She was remembering, in her own way, remembering what it meant to create, to shape something, even if it was just symbols. One morning, the creek broke open fully. The ice cracked like bone, groaned like old wood, and released a rush of water that filled the hollow with sound. The sound startled them. It was too loud, too alive. The mother dropped a cup. The father reached for the axe. The girl stepped outside barefoot again, this time running straight toward the stream. She stopped just before the edge, staring down at the chaos of water tumbling over rocks. She reached out with one hand. It wasn't a greeting. It was recognition. She knelt, touched it, then began to laugh. Not madness, not joy, just a laugh that rose from the place beneath words, the place where survival begins and ends. She ran back to the cabin dripping and barefoot and said, "It's loud again." The mother looked up. The father nodded. No one spoke more than that. That night, the father shaved again. Properly. He found a small mirror wrapped in cloth behind the flour sack. When he held it up, he didn't recognize the man looking back. His beard was streaked with gray. His lips were cracked. His eyes were no longer angry, just tired. He shaved anyway. He didn't do it for vanity. He did it to begin again. The girl began helping with the goats. They had made it barely. The older one had gone blind during the last freeze, but she still ate. The chickens had not been so lucky, but the girl didn't mourn them. She scattered seeds into the softening soil without being asked. The father watched her from the porch. "She's planting," the mother said. "She's hoping," he corrected. She nodded. Same thing. By the third week of thaw, the trail to town was nearly visible again. The father walked it alone one morning. Not all the way, just to the bend near the old pine stump. Just far enough to know the world was still there. He stood in the sun for several minutes, unsure what to do. It felt wrong to walk too far, as if stepping beyond the clearing might undo everything they had earned. He returned before noon. Didn't speak of it. The girl began whittling small wooden animals from bark. The mother combed her hair and braided it. The fire, for the first time in months, was allowed to burn out completely. No one panicked. They lit a candle instead. The cabin was no longer a prison. It was something softer now. Still damaged. Still dark in places. But livable. The girl sang a song one morning. It had no melody anyone recognized, but it had rhythm. The mother tapped her fingers to it. The father smiled without showing teeth. Spring was not sudden. It was slow. A thaw in the creek. A blade of green. A burst of yellow in the trees. But more than anything, it was a question. Now that they had survived, could they remember how to live? That was the hardest part. Not the cold, not the hunger, but the return. Because survival makes you small, cautious, distant, and spring wants you open, vulnerable. The girl chased a squirrel one day, laughed when it ran up a tree. The father taught her to fish again. They didn't catch anything, didn't need to. The mother cried while washing her face with warm water, not because she was sad, but because she could feel her skin again. Everything was tender now, even joy, and that tenderness was the truest sign that spring had returned, not to the land, but to them. The first time they spoke of the past, it came softly, like all the hardest things do, not in a confession, not with tears, but with a question. The girl was sitting on the porch. Her fingers were caked with dirt from the garden, and a smudge ran along her cheekbone where she had brushed her face without thinking. The sun was setting. The sky had turned the color of rusted copper, streaked with pale blue and fading gold. The creek murmured below. Birds sang without urgency. The kind of evening that made you forget there was ever anything else. The mother sat beside her, knitting something from scraps. It didn't matter what, it was the motion that counted. The rhythm. The father was repairing a loose hinge on the door, not because it needed it badly, but because he needed the sound of work. Then the girl asked, almost too quietly to hear, "Do you remember when the fire went out?" The question floated. No one answered right away. The hinge squeaked. The knitting stopped. Even the creek seemed to hush for a moment. The mother glanced at her daughter, then at her husband. He did not look up, but he said, "Yes." And that was how it began. Not with panic, but with honesty. The mother sighed, long and slow. "I thought you had died." "I thought you had," the father said. The girl blinked. "I was under the table," she said. The mother nodded. 4 hours. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It was not afraid. It was remembering. That night, they ate outside for the first time. It wasn't warm, not really, but it was dry. The kind of cold that brushes your skin instead of cutting it. They set the table with mismatched bowls and tin cups. The stew was thin but had flavor. Onion, salt, dried herbs. The goat watched from the fence. A bird nested in the eaves. The father said, "We should speak of it." The mother hesitated. "Why?" "Because it happened." The girl looked at both of them and said, "Because we're still here." That seemed to settle it. They didn't speak all at once. They took turns. The mother went first. She told them about the day she thought she'd lost time, when she'd woken and didn't know how many days had passed. She had boiled snow that wasn't there, stirred an empty pot for hours, whispered to someone in the corner who was never really there. The father didn't judge. He only nodded. He told them he used to count footsteps. Back and forth. Back and forth. 24 from the bed to the door. 12 to the stove. He'd recite them like a prayer. When the numbers changed, he thought the house had moved. The girl said, "I liked the circles." Her voice was soft. They made sense. The mother touched her shoulder. "They saved you." "I think so," the girl whispered. Over the next few days, it became a ritual. Not every evening, not every meal, but when the light softened and the wind blew right, someone would say, "Do you remember?" And someone would answer. They remembered the food freezing before it finished cooking. They remembered sleeping in shifts, not to protect from intruders, but from the cold inside their own bones. They remembered laughter once, wild, high-pitched, unstoppable. None of them could say who it came from, or why it stopped so suddenly. They remembered the day the bucket shattered, just split apart in their hands like glass. The water inside had expanded, frozen, destroyed the wood. "I cried over that bucket," the mother said. "No," the father corrected gently. "You screamed." She smiled without shame. That too. They remembered the cellar, but only barely. "I thought I heard him," the girl said once, almost in a whisper. The mother turned pale. "What?" "In the cellar. My brother. Before we buried him. I thought I heard him calling." No one spoke for a while. Then the father said, "I did too." One evening, they spoke of the goat. The blind one. How it had leaned against the wall, trembling, and how they had wrapped it in the child's old blanket. The mother had wept then, not for the goat, but because she had forgotten the blanket still smelled like him. The girl nodded slowly. "That's why I stopped talking." No one asked her to explain. They didn't need to. They remembered the silence. They had each lived inside it. They remembered the storm. Not just wind and snow, but the one that came after the boy died. The sky had turned dark at noon. The snow fell sideways. The girl said, "That was when the voices came." "What voices?" her father asked, though he already knew. "In the fire. In the wall. In the floor." The mother didn't look surprised. "I heard them too." "I never did," the father said. And the mother replied, "That's why you saved us." He looked away. "I didn't save anyone." But neither of them contradicted him, because sometimes surviving is saving. The girl began drawing again. Not circles this time. People. Her family. But not how they looked now. How they looked then. Small figures in a large cabin. Fire barely lit. Eyes too wide. Limbs stiff and crooked like old marionettes. But always touching, always connected by a thread of chalk or a shadow line. The drawings appeared on the inside of the cabin wall. The mother didn't stop her. She helped her find charcoal. The father just watched. He said nothing, but every time he passed the wall, he touched the edge of one of the drawings. A quiet thank you, a silent remembering. And then one day, the girl said, "Do you think we were meant to survive?" That question was harder. The mother didn't answer. The father stood still for a long time, then said, "We weren't meant to die." The girl frowned. "That's not the same." "No," he said, "it isn't." But they talked more after that. Not just of the past, but of what came next. The girl said she wanted to go to the ridge in summer. The mother said they might keep chickens again. The father said the trail to town would open soon. They said things they couldn't have said before, because now they were not afraid of the past. They had survived it, named it, and in doing so, they had made it smaller. Still monstrous, still bitter, but not nameless. And nothing is more terrifying than the unnamed. That night, they lit a lantern and left it outside the door. No reason, just because. It glowed against the dark, casting long shadows. And in the flicker, they could almost see them again, the people they used to be, sitting in that same place, months ago, afraid of light, afraid of sound, afraid of remembering. Now, the remembering was a lantern, and it stayed lit until morning. The season that came after. They never called it spring. Not once. Even when green touched the tree branches like shy fingers. Even when the earth softened and gave birth to flowers so small they looked like apologies. Even when the creek ran full and clear, and birds sang in full-throated choruses from the roofline. They didn't say the word. It had become too small to carry the weight of what came next. Instead, they called it after. The season that came after. The girl was the first to rise each day now. She stepped out barefoot still, even though the mornings were wet and cold. She didn't mind. Her toes were stronger than before. Her body remembered stone and frost, and no longer feared them. She stood in the field the morning the first shoots rose, bent down, pressed her finger to the tiny green blade, and whispered something no one heard. Not thanks, not hope, just acknowledgement. The world had not ended, and neither had they. Inside the cabin, the walls bore new marks. The soot circles had faded. The charcoal drawings had grown. Now the girl drew faces. They weren't perfect. Some were lopsided, others blurred. But they had eyes, smiles, hair, movement. Sometimes they were laughing, sometimes crying, sometimes simply sitting, as if waiting for the people who drew them to join them again. The mother dusted around them now, not over them. The drawings were part of the house now, just like the beams, just like the cold hearth, just like the scars. The goat had died quietly 2 weeks after the thaw. They had buried it beside the boy, without tears. Not because they didn't care, but because grief, now, came in quieter shapes. The father planted thyme on the mound. The girl scattered salt over the earth. The mother tied the old quilt into a single long braid and placed it in the cellar rafters. Not to forget, but to remember differently. The trail to town was open again, and this time they went. All 3 of them. They walked, not rode, feet against stone, breath calm, silence held between them like a shared language. No one spoke until they reached the edge of the ridge, where the old pine stump still stood like a sentinel. Then the girl said, "It smells like before." The mother said, "It smells like after." The father said nothing, but he took her hand. Town was smaller than they remembered. Or maybe they were larger. People stared, not with cruelty, but with quiet reverence. They were the ones who made it. The family from the high ridge. The ones who hadn't been seen in nearly 5 months. The ones everyone had whispered were probably dead. They didn't offer explanations. They bought flour, soap, a comb. The girl touched every bolt of cloth in the general store and chose the one with blue flowers. The mother bought needles and a single lemon. The father picked a tin of coffee and one spool of twine. Before they left, the girl asked the storekeeper, "Did others come back?" The woman hesitated. "Some," then added, "but not all." The walk home felt lighter, even with the weight of goods. They talked more, laughed even. The girl told a story about a goat she made up. The mother shared a memory of her own mother, burning bread. The father didn't speak much, but when they crossed the creek, he pulled his boots off and walked through barefoot. The girl followed. They laughed, and the sound startled the birds into flight. It was the loudest thing they'd heard in weeks. The next day, they opened the windows. Not just the shutters. The windows. Let air flow. Let dust rise. Let spring, after, fill the cracks. The mother sang while scrubbing the table. The father repaired the roof. The girl strung twine between two trees and hung strips of old cloth like flags. They fluttered in the breeze, each one different, each one a piece of something they'd almost lost. That night, the girl asked, "What will we call this year?" The father looked up. "You mean the calendar?" She nodded. "Is it a new year?" The mother stirred the fire. "Feels like one." The girl said, "We should name it." The father said, "What name?" She thought, then said, "The year we didn't die." And that, they all agreed, was fair. Later that week, visitors came. The neighbors. A man and his daughter. They didn't knock. Just appeared, quiet and gentle as the season. The father offered tea. The mother brought out bread. The girl showed them her drawings. The neighbor's daughter was younger. She smiled at the drawings, said they looked like dreams. The girl said, "They are." The father asked how their winter had gone. The neighbor said, "We lost two." The mother touched his hand. No one said more. They didn't need to. The girl took the little girl to the stream, showed her where the ice had broken, where the squirrel had hidden, where the snow had once covered the trees completely. They sat on a rock and looked up at the sky. The little girl said, "It's hard to believe it was so bad." And the older girl said, "That's how it stays alive. If you forget, it comes back worse." At night, the family burned the last of the winter logs. Not because they were cold, but because fire still meant something. It meant survival. It meant memory. It meant watching something burn and knowing, this time, it wasn't you. The girl began writing in chalk on the beams above her bed. Not poems, not stories, just names of things that mattered. Fire, goat, salt, quilt, brother, circles, roof, after, lemon, squirrel, silence, sun. Every night, she added one. One night, the mother climbed the ladder and read them all. She didn't cry. She just added her own word. Hope. The cabin changed. It looked the same from outside. But the air was different. Not just cleaner. Lighter. Less afraid. There were still cracks. Still silence. Still shadows. But now there was something else. Now there was choice. They could choose what to plant, where to sleep, who to be. And one morning, when the girl woke and opened the door, she saw 3 deer standing in the clearing. They didn't run. They watched her. She watched them. Then, softly, she whispered, "You're late," and smiled, because she knew. They'd been there the whole time, just waiting for the after.